So good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Walsh. I am co-primary investigator of the International Space Station Archaeological project. And yes, you've heard that right. We are studying the International Space Station as an archaeological site. And you might say to yourself, I don't understand what that means. I thought archaeologists only worked in the distant past, as Richard just said. In fact, I started my career as a Greek archaeologist. I started out working on the island of Sicily, and also I've worked in Spain and in Jordan and other countries around the world, looking for evidence of how humans behaved in the past, in the distant past. However, it's important to know, and this might help you understand what we're doing here, it's important to know that archaeology is not so much obsessed with very old things as much as it is interested in using particular kinds of evidence for understanding how humans live, how they behave, how they interact with one another, and importantly for this talk, how they adapt to new environments. And that evidence that we use is what we call material culture. Material culture just means built spaces, architecture like what we're in at the moment, and also the objects that we surround ourselves with. This is the primary, not the exclusive, but the primary evidence that we use as archaeologists to understand humanity. Right? So the project that I work on, we've been doing this for 8.5 years now. My co-PI is Alice Gorman, one of the other EC50 honorees of this year. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our project and why I think it's important. This is our archaeological site. It is 400 kilometers above our heads. It is moving 28,000 kilometers an hour. It orbits the Earth 16 times a day. I may have the highest and the fastest archaeological site that exists. But in any case, it is a fascinating site because, among other things, it is the size of a football field. It is made up of 12, 15 habitable modules. It has been visited by 280 people over a 23.5-year period. This is the most number of people that has gone to any spacecraft in the history of our travel in space, and so that's why it's really interesting. It's an intensively inhabited site. Okay, so the title of this talk, The Past of the Future of the Past. You may also be wondering, as I say, we're studying this site as archaeologists. Why would you even do that? You can talk to the crew, and there are even a couple of people in the audience here today who have been to the International Space Station. Why don't you just ask them what it's like? And we can certainly do that. But what archaeology allows us to do is to gather hard data over long periods of time and to illuminate aspects of the lived experience of the crew that they might not even be able to articulate themselves, things they might not have been noticing, or patterns over the long term. So that's what we're interested in. Now, the title of this section of my talk, The Past of the Future, the ISS started in the 1980s as a plan, something called Space Station Alpha, became Space Station Freedom, and then in the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, became the International Space Station when NASA decided to work with the Russian space agency, Roscosmos, and they were already planning a successor station to the Mir, which was called Mir 2. They decided to put these things together. It became the ISS. At the time that happened, we're really talking about the state of the art of living in space. Right? That's what I mean about the future, right? So this is what people think, like, this is the most futuristic thing we can do, place we can live, is a space station, and this is what it looked like. Well, archaeologists, we're looking at the past of that future. This is how it started. So what you're looking at is a mission that happened in December of 1998, which joined an already orbiting Russian space module, which was called Zarya, to an American module called Node 1, using the space shuttle. And this is when it began. So these two elements of the space station have actually been in orbit for more than 25 years now. That's actually amazing because initially this project was supposed to end in 2016, but it's still going and it's supposed to go for several years more. This is what it looks like now. So here we have the entire space station as it's built out with all its modules. We have what's called the US orbital segment at the front of the space station, the top in this image, and the Russian segment at the aft of the space station, each with multiple modules. And just to underline what I was saying about the intensity of habitation of this site, here we're looking at the population over time. The space station has being continuously inhabited by at least 2 people that whole time. This is an extraordinary thing for those of us who are old enough to remember when there wasn't always somebody in space, but there's been somebody always in space since November 2nd of 2000. The lowest was 2 crew members soon after the Columbia disaster, but it's risen as high as 12 or 13 at a time when the space shuttle was visited at times. So this is really fascinating. And this is what it looked like when it was first inhabited. This is the very first expedition. This is a Russian module known as Zvezda, and it's all clean, and things are new and shiny, but it's also a little bit cluttered, and it doesn't look like Star Trek, right? It doesn't look like the sci-fi imaginary worlds that we're used to thinking about the future, but this is what the future looked like in 2000. Here is an American module. This is what we call Node 3 at the time that it was being installed in 2010. And at the moment, it's hard white plastics, but it's free of all of the things that would eventually go into it, including exercise equipment, a treadmill, the US latrine, another piece of exercise equipment behind it's a lifting device, computers, and just all the stuff that ends up there. This is the thing that archaeologists want to study. We're inspired by this extraordinary quote that actually appeared 52 years ago in a National Academy of Sciences report that called a crewed spacecraft a micro-society in a mini-world. They recognized that there are social and cultural components to life in space. That's what archaeologists can illuminate. That's what we're interested in. And we have 3 really key questions that we want to examine that are kind of driving our research. First of all, that question of adaptation that I mentioned before. How do humans adapt to this unusual environment of isolation, confinement, and especially microgravity, which we are not evolutionarily adapted for? Second, we're interested in how, on the one hand, people who are designing space stations and planning missions have an intended function for the architecture or for the facilities inside the space station, for the objects. Do they always get used that way? Is that what really happens? Or are there different functions that develop over time? And finally, we're very interested in thinking about how social science approaches like ours can actually be really useful to space agencies and to the space industry in helping them think harder and differently about what they need to do to help their crews live happier, healthier, and more productive lives. This is the kind of image that got us really turned on. This is from 2009. In that same Russian module I showed you a few minutes ago, we have an American astronaut on the left, we have a Japanese astronaut in the middle, and a Hungarian-American space tourist on the right. In this Russian space, that gives you a sense of its international nature. But the thing that really got us going is all this stuff on the wall. Did you all notice those items? Did you ever think that some of those kinds of items might be up there? There's mission patches and flags, and there's paintings, including Russian Orthodox icons. There's 4 of them, by the way. There's 2 up here. There's 1 behind this fellow's head. There's another one up there in the corner. There's a Russian Orthodox cross. There are toys. There are photographs of Soviet space heroes like Yuri Gagarin. This is a little bit like a refrigerator door. That is to say, the kinds of things that you put up there to show what you're interested in, to kind of say something about your identity, right? So we became interested in, was that stuff always there? Is it always in the same location? Well, we started looking at various photos that have been published of this space, of this visual display, as we call it, on the ISS. And hopefully you're seeing in this kind of montage of images that there was always stuff up there, but it was not always the same stuff, and it didn't always exist in the same place. Things were being moved around over time, put up, taken down. Okay. So what can we do with that? Well, like archaeologists do, we start cataloging it into a database, and we start trying to understand how many of these things are, and do the patterns change over time? I know everybody loves charts, I'm sorry, but we're going to look at this one just briefly so I can make a point. That is to say that we can actually see that there is real change over time in the number of things and the kinds of things. So this is very basic. We've done other analyses of this, but just, we see it grow and wane and grow and wane. It's like a sine wave, right, of growth and decline. But we can even break it down further. I mean, it's probably very interesting to you that there's religious items on this space station. Some of the crew are clearly religious. But we see that in the early period, around 2002, When there are many items on the wall, relatively few of them are religious, compared to, say, later between 2005 and 2009, when there's another peak of the amount of items that are there. Much more, a higher proportion of them are religious in nature. What's going on? Well, in looking at what's going on back on Earth, in Russia, there's a peak of patriotism due to, first of all, in 2005, you have the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. In 2008, you have the Russian invasion of Georgia, and we can even see out here, because we only did 14 years in this analysis, but we can start to see a rise of patriotism around the beginning of the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So there seems to be some connection between religious displays and what's going on back on Earth. That's something that nobody had ever really noticed about life in space. Okay. We actually even were able to take this back a little bit further and look at the space station Mir and see that that same location, by the way, the Mir core module that we're looking at here, was the architectural basis for the Zvezda module. So it's the same architecture, same design, and they're using it in the same way. There's a long-standing tradition of using this space among the cosmonauts. That's really interesting, cultural traditions and how they get transmitted from crew to crew over time. Okay. So now I want to talk about what it means to study this past and how it might affect the future. And I'm going to do that by talking about the experiment that we actually did on the International Space Station in 2022. And that consisted, this was my colleague Alice's brainwave, her idea, was that we could adapt one of the most basic techniques in archaeology, terrestrial archaeology, to the space context. And what we do when we come to a new site is we might grid out the whole site. We don't know what we're going to find over the site. We don't know what the whole site is going to look like. We can grid it out with 1 meter squares, 1 meter square because we can dig those pretty quickly, choose them randomly and dig a few of those squares, and therefore sample the site to get a sense for the whole. We call this the shovel test pit, and you're looking at one on Earth here. What if we did this on the space station? So we came up with this idea, and because everything in space, you might already know, has an acronym, we called it the Sampling Quadrangle Assemblages Research Experiment, or SQUARE. And this is what we sent to NASA saying that we wanted to look at, just an example of one of the areas we chose. This is the galley in the US Node 1 module where the crew often eats its meals, and that yellow square is like, this is what we want to target. Here is astronaut Caleb Barron actually installing the first of our squares. These were marked with pieces of yellow, what's called Kapton tape, at the corners, so that we're demarcating our sample areas. This is the first time that archaeology has ever been done off of the planet Earth. We felt like, and I know this phrase has already been used in this conference, but our giant leap for archaeology into space, into a new domain. So she's placing the upper right corner of one of our squares. And she's floating. This is amazing. I was watching this at 6 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles, 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the space station, and watching this happen. It just blew my mind. So there it is, our one giant leap. Okay, and this is just, I'm going to show you a couple quick examples of what these images look like. You can see the corners of the square here. This is that galley area. We have a pantry made of mesh bags that hold condiments and candy. Astronauts eat a lot of candy, we learned in this. They really do eat a lot of candy. But most interesting, what you can see off in the lower left corner, somebody is eating their lunch, we can't see them, eating their lunch and reading an ebook on an iPad because they're eating alone. I don't know that anybody's ever documented that as an activity in space before, but it's probably what you would do if you were eating alone. You'd have a magazine or a book or your phone or whatever you've got so that you're occupying yourself mentally while you're while you're eating. Or we have up in the upper right corner and in the middle right, we have tubes of cake frosting. What's going on there? You can't bake on the ISS. There's no oven. Well, it turned out that 2 of the American crew members were making a birthday cake for one of the cosmonauts. They took some muffins and they glued them together with honey and they covered it with the frosting and posted it on Instagram. We didn't need them to do that, though. We knew that there was something going on with food here that was special and unusual. And this is what anthropologists have studied for years, the idea that people build and maintain relationships through food, through making food for other people, through eating together. Look, it's happening in space. Okay, This is my favorite photo. I'm just going to show you quickly because this is in the Node 3 module, and I'll come back to it, but we have our photographer for the day, Mark Vandehei, photobombed by Kayla Barron because she was exercising right next to that, so she's poked her head in. That gave us a sense that the crew was actually enjoying what we were doing, so we were happy to see that. This is what we're working with. So here we're in the American Node 2 module at a workstation that's actually called the Maintenance Work Area, or MWA. And so we've outlined the square. You see the corners, you can see the tape at the corners, but we've given you a sense of it. We're looking at what is all the material culture, all those items that are inside the square. What are they? Where are they located? Do they change over time? This is what, after we've tagged one of the images, that looks like. And you can see all the items that you see here. Maintenance work area. Okay, well, there are tools. There's a bag of tools over here, a multi-tool, things like that. But there's actually a lot of other kinds of items in this image. What other kinds of items are there? There's writing implements like notepads and pens and markers. There's scientific equipment like goggles and loupes for magnifying what you're looking at. There's rubber gloves in a bag up here. There's an LED light. There's a bag of wet wipes there for cleaning yourself. But also, most numerous actually, 44% of all the items that were found in this area are what we call restraints. This is actually NASA's term for a kind of thing that holds another thing in place, which is really important in a microgravity environment, right? So holding other things in place, we have clips and carabiners and adhesive tape and resealable plastic bags. Those are incredibly important in this location. We were actually able to identify 8 different phases of activity over the 60 days of photographs that we got, and this is a particularly short and intense period of activity, one of those phases where a European Space Agency experiment on concrete hardening was happening inside a portable glove bag in this location. So you're like, okay, science is happening there. However, 50 of the 60 days, this is one of those other phases, 50 of the 60 days, there was no discernible change from day to day. There was no activity that could really be identified going on here. What does that mean? What it means, in fact, is that rather than this being a maintenance work area, it's actually more of a storage location. It's kind of like, I like to say, like a pegboard that you would have in your garage or in your garden shed, where you just leave things because it's a convenient place, there's lots of attachment points. And here, there's tons of Velcro to stick things to. So there's many items that are here that may not even be used in this space, but because of all the Velcro, it's very handy for that. That's interesting. That means, let me go back actually, that means that if you are a designer of a future space station, you might actually want to think about optimizing for activities that are not maintenance. We actually didn't see any maintenance. We saw some science, a little bit of training over those 60 days, but mostly storage. So maybe storage is the thing you need to think about. How are you providing that to the crew to make their lives easier in multiple places around the space station? This is the other of the 6 squares that we've currently completed looking at. By the way, I should say in this square, we cataloged 3,806 items over 60 days. In this one, 1,800. This is actually located in Node 3. This is where the photo bombing was happening we saw before. There's a lifting device here. There's the treadmill off to the other side outside the frame, and the latrine is directly behind the photographer. So this is a place, this whole zone is a place for hygiene and for exercise, right? But the wall we were looking at didn't have any designated function, unlike the maintenance work area. It was just an open space. Well, one crew member left their toiletry kit there, excuse me, for almost the entire 2 months that we documented it. This is a place with high activity. The astronauts are actually exercising 2 to 3 hours a day. They are also using the latrine. They are passing through here to get to a storage closet. There's also an observation window for Earth called the cupola that they have to pass by this wall to get to. High traffic, and yet somebody left their toiletry kit in this open space that everybody has to pass by. A very public space. That's interesting, right? And we can't know, by the way, whether the other crew members, we don't know which crew members this toiletry kit is, but we also don't know whether the other crew members resented it or they thought it was okay or what, but anyway, it was tolerated, it was there. It has a toothbrush and toothpaste in here. It has nail clippers and a razor and deodorant and all those things. Let me just say, from my own personal preferences, I wouldn't want to leave that where there's sweat floating around in the air or other bodily fluids that might be emanating from the latrine. What this all goes to demonstrate is that there's a lack of affordances and accommodations for the crew for their personal items like a toiletry kit, and even spaces for them to perform body maintenance, to clean and care for their bodies. So this is another area where we've identified that there's something going on here that isn't what's planned and might need to be dealt with. So if I just finish up and come back to our last question, or our driving questions here, and focus especially on this last one, we have started to show how we're revealing, through archaeological techniques and perspectives, new aspects of life in space. And we've been publishing multiple peer-reviewed scientific articles in various venues on this research. However, we also realize that the space industry and space agencies don't always read those peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. So we've actually started a consultancy, which we call Brick Moon, to provide that information and those perspectives to them. It's a way of meeting them on their own terms. And I'll just finish by saying our ultimate goal with this project is to help them make their worlds better. Thank you very much.